All right, so today we'll be talking about global pricing trends of hepatitis C medications. So my name is Anthony Hudzik. I am a postdoc fellow working with ASARA and the UNC School of Pharmacy. So ASARA is a HUR market access consulting firm helping clients with all of their HUR and market access needs. And then also working in tandem with the School of Pharmacy, more specifically the health outcomes departments at the School of Pharmacy. So today's agenda, we're going to focus on three key aspects. First, we're going to set the scene for the research, talk about the burden of disease for hepatitis C. We'll then get into the details about the methods of analysis, what actually happened, how we did it, and then finally we'll talk about the results, the trends we observed, and possibly some of the reasons for those trends, and ultimately the policy implications that come out of it. So first, talking about the burden of disease for hepatitis C. So as we know, hepatitis is caused by three different viruses. You have hepatitis A, B, and C. So starting from the top, hepatitis A is usually the most non-severe case of hepatitis. It's acute, usually clears by itself, doesn't really cause any lasting health outcome issues. Followed by that is hepatitis B. So stepping up a little bit more in terms of severity. And for this specific virus, you do have more chronic infections. And then, but again, still not usually a severe infection coming out of this. Where the crux of the burden comes from is hepatitis C. These infections can result in, or is more likely to result in a chronic infection. And in turn of that, they're more likely to result in either liver failure or liver transplants. So really preventing this infection or treating this infection can have dramatic effects downstream in terms of preventing those liver transplants, preventing liver failure, as we know, can be very costly and lead to more likely death for the patients. So that's where we're going to focus on today. One other thing to mention about these viruses and to set the stage a little bit more is hepatitis A and B both have vaccines for them, while hepatitis C does not. So, which further highlights the need for effective treatments. When it comes to the prevalence of hepatitis C, it varies depending on region, anywhere from 1.3% in North America all the way up to 3.8% in Asia. What this leads to is almost 180 million patients worldwide are affected by hepatitis C. Not saying all these cases are severe. This is just the estimated prevalence of any cases from non-severe to severe patients. So now getting to the crux of hepatitis C, the treatments. So ultimately, there are currently 7 approved antiviral medications on the market for hepatitis C. And these were first started in 2013 with Sovaldi. And then as you can see, there were additional medications approved every year following up to 2017. What's interesting about this class of medications is it kind of revolutionized the treatment for hepatitis C. Before, the treatments were very ineffective when it came to HCV, anywhere from like 30-ish% cure rates. So Sovaldi really changed the game. It was a direct-acting antiviral, so it really acts directly on hepatitis C. And due to this new mechanism of action, it led to cure rates up to 95%. And so a dramatic increase in effectiveness, as we saw with Sovaldi. All the future medications slightly improved that cure rates or targeted various genes of hepatitis C, so leading to different patient populations they could treat. But ultimately, what we see with these medications is that they're super effective when it comes to HCV. There are some medications worth calling out, like Vicurapac, which was discontinued in 2015 due to some safety issues. So that's why we only have currently 7 approved medications on the market. What is the issue when it comes to HCV treatments? So they're very effective, yes, but the big issue is that they're very expensive. So as you can see on this chart, the cheapest medication that we see is Hepatitis, and that's $50,000 for an 8-week treatment. depending on the treatments, they can be anywhere from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. I found standardized the cost across 8-week treatments, since all these medications can be done in 8 weeks. So Spadatir, 50,000, all the way up to Harvoni, which is 100,000. And this is just the list price of the medication. This isn't factoring rebates or insurance or anything of that nature. This is what a patient would pay if they strictly had no insurance. So a very big burden on patients if they lack insurance. And then taking that perspective a little bit further out and looking at what is society or governments paying for these treatments. So this is based off of Medicare Part D spending through CMS. And we looked at 6 of the major spending drugs for CMS in 2020. And as you can see, it ranges dramatically, with Epclusa being close to 900 million spending by the governments on Epclusa in the year 2020, all the way to about $1 million for Spadatir in 2020. But ultimately, what that leads to is the CMS Medicare Part D is paying roughly $1.5 billion on HCV treatments a year. And this is just Medicare Part D. This isn't looking at commercial plans or any non-covered patients. This is strictly Medicare spending. So you can only imagine how much higher this cost of disease is on the American population. And again, this is just US specific. This isn't looking at worldwide spending. So with all that being said, obviously there's a very big need for these medications, but there's also a very big cost for these medications. So ultimately, what we decided to look at was to examine the differences in price across countries over time, and what are the possible factors leading to these price changes, contributing to these price changes. So getting into the methods of the analysis. So ultimately, we first started off doing descriptive analysis on the data sets, just looking at very high level trends. What's like the mean cost of the medication per year? What are the average percent reduction per year for these medications? And then we looked at it from both like a class level, looking at all drugs together, and then also looking at each individual drug by itself. So after we did just a high level descriptive analysis of the pricing, we then did some more higher level analysis with a linear regression. And this was really done focusing on the number of manufacturers for each medication, and looking at high level how this competition for HCV impacted price over time. And we controlled for a region, year, and income level. Ultimately, we did look at controlling for drugs. Why we did not control for each individual drug is we did a collinearity and association test and found that they were collinear. So there's no reason to add that extra level of granularity to the regression. So ultimately, the drugs we looked at were the 8 we talked about earlier: Sovaldi, Vicarex, Epclusa, Mavorix, the Vicura Pack, Harvoni, Spadatir, and Vosevi. So look at those 8 medications from 2013 to 2019. So from the year of first approval of Sovaldi all the way to the most recent data point available in 2019. We use IQVIA minus data sets, and that data set provides ex-manufacturer price of each medication. So the caveat there is it's not actually reflecting what patients are paying or reflecting any rebates happening. It's just the ex-manufacturer price. And ultimately, we had data across 65 different countries, and we'll get into the specific countries we looked at in a little bit. So as I mentioned, 4 variables are really examined: the number of manufacturers for each medication, the WHO region, WHO region. So WHO classifies each country in a various region. So when I looked at if pricing was influenced by those regions, country income level, want to see if country income level influenced negotiation power by these various countries. And then finally, GDP per capita. just to see how price was relative to the GDP for each country. Before we could even begin our analysis, we had to make sure we were standardizing each of the data points to a common dose or a common strength. As you can see on the screen, there are various different pack sizes, various different strengths. So we standardize each pack size and strength to just one dosage units. So the most common dosage units we picked, standardized all the doses to that, and then did the pack size just to one tablet. So its price is really per tablet. So now getting to the pricing trends of our analysis. Looking at where the data came from, on the left-hand side, you'll see a map of the world. Countries colored in blue are countries we had data access to. And as you can see, a majority of our data came from the Americas, 24%, and Europe, 40%. We did have a little bit of data from Eastern Mediterranean, Western Pacific, and Southeast Asia. And unfortunately, in our data set, we lacked data in the African region. So we do have a focus primarily on the Americas and Europe. When it came to looking at the data from various income levels, as you imagine, looking at that, since our data set comes mostly from Americas and Europe, a high percentage of that came from high income countries, roughly 68%, followed by 11% of upper middle income countries and 21% from lower middle income countries. So definitely skewed more to those higher income countries. Looking at it, the data trends from a 50,000 foot view, this graph is showing average drug price per dose over time for each individual medication. So as you can see, just from a high level, drug prices are decreasing from whatever date they were approved from to 2019. Some drugs had more dramatic decreases over time that we'll get into, but ultimately what we see here is that they are decreasing gradually. One thing to call out that was interesting from this analysis was that we did see these two convergence of prices for these medications. We're not too sure the reason behind why these two convergent points happen. We're thinking it might be due to the patient population these drugs are specifically targeting. As I mentioned earlier, some drugs only target certain genes of HCV or certain patient populations. That could be a reason why we see these convergence in price. They're more converging along lines of they're more similar products. When looking at the actual percent change in price from approval to 2019, we do see that drugs that were longer on the markets, Sovaldi, Vicirapac, Sovaldi was approved in 2013, Vicirapac on 2014. They had the most dramatic decreases in price. Sovaldi had 73% compared to Vicira's 79%. Drugs that were approved a little bit later, like Spadatir and Vosevi, those have not had as dramatic as a percent change in price, but there are some factors to think of when looking at these percent changes. As we saw previously, Sovaldi started at a very high price. Some of the earlier medications started at a very high price and then normalized later on, while some of the later medications started at a smaller price. So there's not as much room to wiggle there. This graph is showing the percent change per year for antiviral drugs as a class. So this isn't looking at specific drugs, this is looking at all 8 medications together. There are some interesting trends. You can see in 2014, it was a roughly 20% decrease in price, 2015, 45-ish%. And then when we see the trend, the percent increase starting to go back up, what we notice is this is due to some of the medications entering the market at a very high price. Like Harvoni entered at a very high price compared to its competitors. Same with like Zapatitier and Maverick. So that could be some of the reason that we see this 0% change in price in the year 2017 is just because of those recent approvals. But then we see it again dropping off in 2018 and 2019. This graph or map, so one thing that we wanted to look into is, so just because a price in the US of $20 is not the same as $20, the same price in like Brazil, for instance, where the cost with the GDP per capita is not the same. So we wanted to see how were these prices correlating or related to the GDP per capita for each country. And this is showing the price to GDP per capita percentage for the most current year of data. So most of the time, this is the 2019 data. And the GDP per capita was based off of the income levels, or based off of World Bank classification. So in the light blue is a 0 to 9% of GDP per capita ratio. This color blue is 10 to 19%. The more the dark green is 20 to 29, and then the very dark green is 30 to 39. As you can see, there is a higher focus on this ratio, a higher ratio in the European countries and Brazil. What we noticed is that in these specific countries, the prices started out very high and then began to decrease more dramatically. But also doing some secondary research, we did notice that especially the countries in the darker colors, Italy, Spain, Brazil, they noticed that their negotiation has been going poorly when it comes to HCV medications, and they have been taking steps to address their negotiating tactics with pharma. So this does fall in line mostly with these countries' change of strategy when it comes to negotiations. This next graph is again looking at that price to GDP per capita ratio from initial year to most current year. And again, you see the darker colors more in Europe, which is indicating a bigger decrease in this ratio, and also in Brazil. So again, prices start out very high in these higher income countries, but due to whether they have better negotiation tactics or whatever the case may be, they're able to bring the prices back down more rapidly compared to some of these other countries. Some countries to call out, like the United States, as we know, has a big drug pricing issue. They did not successfully negotiate a big decrease in price compared to their European counterparts. So as we see here, just highlighting the need for a more effective price negotiation and price transparency across the country, and not all countries are exhibiting that the benefits that some of these European countries are experiencing when it comes to decreasing the price of these very high price medications. When getting into the actual regression we ran for the analysis, like I mentioned earlier, we really looked at how the number of manufacturers for each drug influenced price over time. And what we found was that, as you would expect, the number of manufacturers, the addition of one manufacturer to a drug decreased the price by $20 roughly for each manufacturer. There are other aspects that were associated with a decrease in price, as I alluded to earlier, like the high income countries, European countries as well. So, but really the primary scope of this regression was to look at the number of manufacturers, and we did see that there were price reductions were significantly associated with a greater number of manufacturers. Some strengths and limitations behind this. So we do know that there is a lot of literature out there that does support the idea of competition and price. As you increase competition, price usually decreases. Another strength of this analysis is that the IQVIA minus data set did have access to all approved products currently on the market. So we're able to capture the very specific mechanism of action that is the most efficacious in HCV. Limitations I've kind of mentioned throughout the presentation, and this really relates to the data set not really having access to those rebates that may be going on behind the scenes. It's at the ex-manufacturer price level. So does not capture those rebates, sensitive to outliers, as we mentioned with that Maverick example. And then most of the data did come from North America and Europe, so we're definitely skewed towards those regions and towards those income levels as well. Some other things not listed on a slide that were interesting is another limitation could possibly be that we did not have access to like patient level demographics for these prices. So we weren't able to factor in like the patient influence, whether it be the specific indication they were using these drugs for, things like that. So it's very a high level ex-manufacturer price. Policy implications, we've scattered some of these throughout the conversation, but really at the end of the day, increased competition can help reduce pricing is the big picture takeaway here. And not all countries are experiencing equal price decreases, indicating that there are opportunities for price negotiations and there are opportunities for countries to learn from best practices from other countries in terms of helping to reduce these high price medications to a more affordable level for some patients. But on the flip side of that, it is a very a scale you do have to balance in terms of pricing. You don't want prices to be so low that manufacturers completely leave the markets due to the inability to retain their investments on drug development. As we know, drug development is a very expensive process. So you do want to make sure prices are there so that manufacturers have reason to enter the markets, but you don't want them to be too high that patients are losing out on, can't afford those medications. So there is a line you do have to balance here to make sure that medications are still being produced in this disease state that's, as I mentioned, a very prevalent and costly and deadly disease states. So definitely emphasizing that balance between pricing. Had a lot of help from some faculty at UNC, Sachi, Hoihan, and Tatenda, and the DPOP or PACE department at the School of Pharmacy. So just want to give a quick shout out to them as well. And then left a few minutes for questions if there are any.